Hey there, Matt Hamilton, author of Through Travel and Air, Confessions of an Asylum-Seeking Canadian. Welcome back to my online readings. Today it's part 2 of chapter 23 called B to C. If you want to find out what happened, you should listen to the last one, but quickly, I was in a bus accident, and while I was trying to help the other passengers, my bus, with my backpack, passport, money, everything I owned, drove off into the middle of the night, left me stranded. Now, as I was contemplating what to do next, an army truck showed up. I don't know where they were coming from or where they were going. It really didn't matter. But the soldiers hopped off and they said, you sit down, we'll deal with what's going on. And as they were bringing body after body up from this embankment, another bus came by. And thank God they were going to the city I was trying to get to, and they let me on board. Now, I accepted that my backpack and stuff was long gone. So as we're sitting there on the bus, we get stopped at a police checkpoint. And this is where we'll begin B to C. An old, worn-out policeman clambered onto the bus, gazed around, and asked in a sleepy voice if there was a Canadian on board. I knew there wouldn't be another Canuck on the bus, but nonetheless I glanced around at the other passengers. Not surprisingly, nobody raised a hand. Being the only white face on board, I assumed that the Canadian in question must have been me. I raised my hand. The ancient policeman saw me and said, "I have your bag." I jumped off the bus and followed the cop to his fire. There, sitting next to a mat in the ground, were my backpack and chairs. I was speechless. I thanked him profusely as I lugged my retrieved gear onto the bus. I can only guess the driver of my original bus, sometime after leaving the scene of the accident, realized the gear belonging to the only Mzungu was still on board. I'm further assuming that they dropped my backpack at the checkpoint, knowing that I would eventually pass through. Although I'm often mocked for it, thank Christ I had one gigantic Canadian flag sewn onto the top of my rucksack. This was quickly turning out to be the most peculiar roller coaster of an evening in my life. The rest of the journey to Blantyre was uneventful. However, despite having survived an accident that claimed lives and lost and retrieved everything I owned, I was beginning to stress out. My nerves were a wreck. Even a gorgeous sunrise across the Malawian countryside couldn't chill me out. The bullet I had dodged and the bloodbath I had witnessed were replaying themselves repeatedly in my head. I knew that I was one lucky bastard. And I did. And sadly, I still had 30 hours on a bus to look forward to. I still need to get back to Johannesburg. And I wasn't looking forward to that at all. So I was sitting in this hostel in Blantyre, building up some liquid courage, when the barman said, why don't you go down to this grocery store? I hear they fly cargo flights into South Africa. You might get lucky. So I walked down, found the manager, and he said, yeah, we've got a flight leaving in an hour. Can you meet me at the airport? So I raced back to the hostel, grabbed my gear, and out to the airport I go. And so this is where we'll continue the rest of the story. We jumped into the manager's truck and drove to a hangar where an ancient two-prop cargo plane awaited. It was the only plane on the tarmac, so there wasn't any uncertainty that the clump of metal with wings was my ride back to South Africa. I won't pretend to know a lot about aircrafts, but it wouldn't take an aviation historian to know that the plane I was supposed to board was very, very old. Quite possibly, it could be classified as an antique. As I was staring at the plane and trying to determine which world war it had participated in, two pilots emerged from the hangar. Other than nobody else being in sight, I knew they were the pilots because they were wearing the blue suits, ties, hats, aviation sunglasses, and even the pins with the golden wings. It was the standard pilot uniform. I called to them to have a safe flight, but they ignored me and kept walking. The manager looked at me and said, "They probably didn't understand you. They don't speak English. They're from Russia." Russia? Serious, legitimate questions were beginning to materialize in my mind. What were Russian pilots doing in Malawi flying this plane? What the fuck was I doing getting on this poor excuse for an aircraft? I had read somewhere that there was a greater chance of being in an accident on an African airline than there was being in a car accident in North America. There were a lot of car accidents in North America. I considered my limited alternatives. It was either risking my life for 3 hours on the cargo plane or risking my life for 30 hours on a bus. When I looked at my situation that way, I really didn't have an option. I climbed into the back of the plane. The cargo door shut, and even though she was thousands of kilometers away, I felt my mother shiver. She certainly wouldn't approve of my decision to travel with African Cargo Airlines, and I'm sure her maternal instincts were attuned to her son about to take a gamble flying the African skies. Other than the cargo, which consisted of several crates of tomatoes and some large pieces of strange machinery, the plane was empty. Compared with the packed conditions of African transportation, the ample space inside the plane was a welcome and rare luxury. Maybe this flight wouldn't be so bad. However, when the door to the cockpit opened and the two pilots came out, my attitude flipped again. I initially didn't recognize them, for they weren't wearing their uniforms. Instead, they were dressed in tattered and greasy clothing. They looked as though they should be fixing the plane as opposed to flying it. Until that moment, I didn't realize the amount of confidence I placed in people simply because they dressed for the part. When a doctor wears his white lab coat and has a stethoscope hanging from the pocket, I have confidence in his diagnosis. When a pilot is dressed in his blue uniform with his golden wings, I have confidence in his ability to fly. But when these two pilots reappeared dressed like two mechanics, my faith in their capabilities diminished drastically. But what choice did I have? The first engine started up with a loud chug, 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 followed shortly by a struggling second. The plane taxied into position on the runway and increased speed for takeoff. The aircraft rumbled and rattled as it tore down the tarmac. The plane shook so much that I think I saw a screw or two dislodged from the cabin's interior. I could only hope that they weren't important. Just when I thought the vibrations were going to break off the wings, the plane pulled away from the ground. More importantly, it continued to climb to a cruising altitude. My uncertainties about the aircraft's potential to get and stay airborne were, for the time being, eliminated. 3 hours later, I was safely on the ground in Joburg. We hadn't landed at Joburg International Airport, but instead a secondary small craft landing strip on the outskirts of the city. I still had an hour-long taxi ride to town, but this was beside the point. I was safely on the ground. Standing in the small arrival terminal, I glanced up at the clock. Only 20 hours beforehand, I had been standing on a Malawian highway in the middle of the night. I had just been abandoned. I had nothing to my name. Bodies were strewn around me, and I was cursing the heavens. As fate would have it, a mere 20 hours later, I was safely in Joburg with all my possessions, and I was days ahead of schedule. Being able to accomplish this and avoid the torturous, uncomfortable bus journey was an exceptional bonus. It is amazing how quickly one's fortunes could change in Africa. And it's true. In a blink of an eye, bam, you're heading in a different direction on a different form of transportation in some cases. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed that chapter called B2C. And if you'd like to find out more about myself or the book, Through Travel and Error, Confessions of an Asylum-Seeking Canadian, please visit my website, madmaddiesworld.com. We'll see you next week. Until then, have a great one.